Well, hello and welcome back to A Few Minutes With. It's been quite a while since I've done it. There have actually been changes in my life that have necessitated this gap. A new call to a new parish, a new home, a move with the wife and kids. But I'm overjoyed to be back today, and I'm even more joyful that my first guest out of this break is Traci Rhoades, who is a phenomenal blogger and writer who has written a book that we'll be talking about today called Not All Who Wander Spiritually Are Lost from Church Publishing. I highly recommend it. And I also refer to you, for those that watch the video version of this, I refer to Traci in the opening credits as community builder. And we'll talk about that as well. But Traci, it's such a joy to have you here. Thanks so much for being with me.
I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Well, a lot of listeners know, and I think, Traci, I shared with you, this is actually a podcast that started in the height of the pandemic last year. And so typically I would ask my guests how they were doing as they grew into the new life of being isolated by the pandemic. But now things have changed. We're coming back out of, knock on wood, and prayerfully and hopefully out of the pandemic. So instead of asking you just the question, how are you doing? I'm going to expand it a little bit and ask how you're doing in this time of transition from pandemic to being back out in the world.
It's a great question. It's kind of like you're holding both in tandem, right? We want things to be normal again, and some days they feel like it, and then the virus has not gone away, and so we're reminded in ways throughout our day of that as well. So as far as my spiritual self, I am more refreshed. Certainly, I'm not as weary as I was, but still, the world's still not quite the same.
How is your family and your church in particular? And we'll talk about North Point in a little bit, but how's your family and your church adapting to coming out of this pandemic time?
Well, my daughter is back in school full time. She did a mixture of cohort and virtual learning last year. So we're all very, very happy to have her back in school. That routine is pretty important in our life. And my husband is, I would say, about 2/3 working at the office. And then he does have the opportunity at times to be home. He's working from home today, so that's why I'm seated outside. But yeah, family is feeling pretty normal. And church, I think we're mostly back to normal. We had new folks come in that we're trying to get to know during the quarantine. And then we had, unfortunately, some folks who left us as well. So I think, as with many churches, we're just trying to find that comfort level of making sure there's opportunities for the new people to get involved and kind of adjusting to some of those changes still as well.
Yeah. No, your comment about your daughter resonates. Our own kids last year were almost exclusively virtual through just about the entire school year. And it was difficult for them. So having them back in person this year, it was a challenge, we thought, moving and having them start in a brand new school, especially with our oldest child being a senior. That's always a risk, but it's made a huge difference. So I'm glad to know that your experience is the same with your daughter back in and things getting back to normal. I want to launch into the book, and you and I were talking before we started recording that there's so much that I've gotten out of this that I could make an entire series out of this, and I'll try and refrain from doing that and give us a reason to have you back. But I found it to be a very personal, very heartfelt, and at times a very emotional journey that took you from the churches of your youth, Mount Olive, Mount Pleasant, through your youth and college years, and then up to your current church family at North Point. And I find one other remarkable thing about it that we'll touch on in a bit, that you make it almost conversational. It's not just your voice, but you invite the voices of others you've encountered on your journey into telling their story and making it a part of your story. But I'm curious, what was it about this particular moment in your life that you felt was the right time to write this? What was the nudge you got from the Holy Spirit where you walked away saying, okay, I guess now's the time I need to do this?
Yeah, it's kind of a funny story, actually. I started blogging in 2014, and I had always identified as a writer. My background is communication and marketing, so I'd done some form of writing, much of my life. And in 2014, I had been overseeing our women's ministry at my local church for a few years. And I had written some devotional pieces, taught some Bible study and done some writing through that. And I just felt like there was maybe a bigger audience than just my local church body to send out some of these stories that I had. And my blog name is Traces of Faith, which is a spinoff of my name, Traci, but also just that idea of encountering Christ and tracing our faith anywhere, anytime, right? Day in and day out. And so I started writing, and along with writing, I started reading even more than I had been before. And I was reading other people's blogs. And then as they would write books, I would read those. And I really kind of developed a case of what I call holy envy, because I encountered these people who were experiencing Jesus in ways I didn't even know about. Yeah. And I thought to myself, if you can find Jesus in that way, or I always thought that was wrong, but this person seems to have had a legitimate experience of worship and faith in doing that activity. And so it all became a situation where I wanted to at least visit those places. I wanted to learn more. I wanted to do more than just read about these experiences. And one of the very first posts that I wrote on visiting churches and learning new spiritual practices was a visit to a local Catholic church for Ash Wednesday. And that actually became the introduction to the book. And that blog post was very well received. And my readership really then became kind of focused on the idea of exploring these different church traditions and curiosity and learning and undoing, for me and for a lot of my readers, a lot of the misconceptions that we had about Christianity. And when I started writing in 2014 online, I sat down with a gal who at the time had a blog. She doesn't do much of that anymore, but I remember telling her, and she reminds me often, I could never have enough words to fill a book. I don't know how people do that. Like, books are so, and my book's not even that big, but that just seemed overwhelming to me.
Yeah.
And I like to say I wrote myself into a book, because it is a number of at least the concepts that I explored in the blog and on social media. And I just reached a point where I felt like I had to tell two sides. I wanted to tell my evangelical friends what I was experiencing, because I felt like it could really have an impact on their faith as well as it has mine. And number two, I wanted to let Catholics and Lutherans and Quakers, et cetera, these people that I was getting to know and had met online, that I wanted to encounter them, that I wanted to know what their traditions were too. And I wanted to tell them about mine. I write a lot in the book about the different hymns that we used to sing growing up. I give so much thought to the fact that those hymns are like my heart language. I find that a lot of Christians, depending on their background, they might hold to the Nicene Creed being their heart language. That's kind of what bubbles up, is what I call it. For me, it's the hymns. Sometimes I'll be starting the vacuum, and all of a sudden, it'll be learning to lean on Jesus. So I also had by that point, I won't get the timing exactly right. I would say there were probably 4 years between when I started the blog and when I started the process of writing the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I had met so many of these people and loved their stories. And so at first, the book didn't have those stories in it. They were a later edition, but such a good ad. To go and find these people that I had already met in the last few years and invite them to share their church stories, because I also wanted the book to be a reminder that my church story isn't the only one.
Mm-hmm.
We're all encountering this faith journey, and it looks very different for all of us, but all meets right there at the foot of the cross, right?
Yeah,
with Jesus.
absolutely.
So.
And that was, it's funny you mentioned there, or interesting that you mentioned the cross. I remember where you write about going to what you thought was the Stations of the Cross service, and you ended up inadvertently in an Adoration of the Cross service, and how it was a complete shock for you and your
Yes.
daughter, that but it opened up a new opportunity for you both to share that. Have you found that the response to the book from both sides, the evangelical and the Catholics, Lutherans, Quakers, that sort of thing, has it gone beyond and been received or responded to in a way even beyond what you were hoping for?
I think so. You mentioned at the beginning when you were introducing the book that it almost feels more like a conversation piece. And that is 100% what I was going for. I also have a discussion guide that I provide through my blog. It's free, but my vision is seeing small groups sit down with this book and in an evening or over the course of, some time, sharing their own church stories and share. I remember speaking one time at a local church, and a lady said, my neighbor was a Mennonite, and I never really asked her, what her church experience was like. So just triggering those kinds of thoughts and reflections. And as far as I can tell, I think the book is well received by pretty much any tradition. I have made a number of friends with Orthodox, capital O, like Greek Orthodox and Coptic Orthodox believers. And I did not know there was an Orthodox tradition probably until I was 30. I'm from a small town. I grew up Southern Baptist. And so that just wasn't even in my understanding. So I'm thankful that I have made friends, through the book and through writing with individuals like that. I also did have a Jewish woman who she's just a wonderful supporter of writers in general. If you find her in your life, it'll be a gift. And she told me after reading it, I could apply this again and again to my synagogue experience as well.
Wow.
And I really appreciated that, because so much of it is just coming together and obviously not having the same lenses, the same backgrounds, and finding a common faith. That's so much of it.
Yeah. In listening, you talked a minute ago about the audience you were trying to reach. On one hand, the people with a similar evangelical tradition as you come from, and then the other side with the more mainline Catholic Protestant. I wondered too, there was a third audience that struck me as I was reading this, and I don't wonder if maybe somewhere deep inside you recognize this or have seen this as a letter to your daughter, because it seems very much, it talks about your upbringing, your growth, your experiences through the church, and then pivots to where after she's born, it's something that you're sharing with her. So I see almost it's that third audience is your daughter and sharing your life with her through the written word.
I appreciate that. I certainly hope so. I would add too, as you were talking, I had a number of people tell me that it was a healing piece of work for pastors. I share story after story of the various pastors that I've had throughout the years, and we can be really hard on them.
Yes.
And sometimes as a child, I these things were happening and I didn't realize it until I was older and reflecting back on it. But we had pastors who were basically forced out whenever things got to be growing too much, because the church kind of just would have preferred to be comfortable and stay the same. And I had a pastor when I lived in St. Louis who must have been under some kind of pressure. He was a very good pastor, but one Sunday he plagiarized too much of a sermon, and in the congregation were some seminary professors, and they caught it. So, but behind the incident, I just spent a lot of time asking myself, what pressure was he under? What was his schedule too full? And again, a whole conversation that I hope is had as people read the book. Do we give our pastors enough time with their families? Do we give them downtime? Do we critique their sermons to the point that they're under too much pressure to even effectively communicate? A lot of those questions that came up as I was looking at each pastor that I had personally.
Yeah, and talking about clergy transitions, you write about clergy coming and clergy going, but the person that never leaves is Jesus. And asking you again about your experience, why do you think it is that, just from the churches you've been a part of, why it is people sometimes lose sight of Jesus? Because the grief or anger or joy, truthfully, depending on the audience, that the pastor is leaving seems to take such a prominent place. And what can, I as a priest, or what can lay leaders or congregants do to help remind folks that, this transition is a transition, but Jesus is the constant?
That's such a good question. I think the number one response I would give is good and clear communication. Another topic that comes up a lot in the book is when you know to stay at a church and when it is time to move on and go to a different church. And I'm convinced that if we would have some of the hard conversations, and if we could be a little more forthcoming with some of the private information that only leadership and maybe pastors know, we could probably be a more healing place. It could be a more honest exchange. And we've made it so easy to leave, especially in my evangelical world. Yeah. I like to have that conversation with Catholics sometimes, because they might, if they're in a big enough area, go from one parish to another. But for the most part, what they have in the way of Catholic Church is what they have. And I often wonder what must that be like to stay under a priest who maybe you feel like is not impacting you as much, or a beloved priest that moved on, and you have to continue going to church Sunday after Sunday and figuring out, like you said, what's at the core of why I'm attending church. And yeah, it's a good question. I'll probably be thinking about that the rest of the afternoon.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I would say that would definitely be my first answer is we have a hard time communicating in those hard times.
And you even address in the book, there's a line that jumped out at me, and I'm going to paraphrase it here, but talking about the ease with which people leave churches. And that if you're deciding whether or not to leave a church, that it needs to be something you need to deeply wrestle with, and wrestle with any grief that may be involved. And I sometimes wonder, I think about churches that I've left, and for me growing up, it was a matter of necessity. We either moved and did it. I wasn't in a position, but I can only imagine I've seen people where it's, this just isn't doing it for me, and they leave. They don't give a chance to see not just what they can get, but what they can give. I think sometimes they're too focused. It's a consumer approach to church sometimes, rather than being a giver. So I sometimes think that gets lost when people leave as well. But I wanted you to know that line about leaving should be something deeply intentional, deeply reflective, and it may be filled with grief. So I thank you for that. And I hope that's something that resonates with people who may be struggling with their own church situation.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope so. And I think so much of it, I mean, you hit the nail on the head when you said very consumer driven. I literally know people who left because the youth group down the street was a little more active at the time that their youth,
Yeah.
and neither here nor there. I think what it points to more than anything is a lack of understanding and discipleship about the role that church is supposed to play
Mhm.
in an individual's life and in a family's life. Um, and we've created this situation ourselves. I don't, I joke there's 3017 denominations. I don't know the answer, but if we didn't, and I mean, how many times have individuals let go of a pastor, and that pastor went and started a church 2 blocks away, and so half the congregate, I mean, we have created that environment. And all I'm asking in the book, all I'm asking in my own life is I consider the word, because I'm new to the Reformed tradition, the word covenant.
Mhm.
And at our church, we do become covenant members. I don't know that we realize the gravity
Mhm.
of what we were saying, even though maybe we were much more casual about it than what the word covenant intends to be. But yeah, I give it a lot of thought, and I'm always quick to say that doesn't mean you never leave. It doesn't.
Mhm.
Not for any tradition. If you're in a place that's not safe, or in a place that stops being biblical, those are different conversations to have.
Yeah, covenant relationship. I'm glad you brought that up because it's one thing you mentioned from your vantage point, it's something churches have lost sight of. Just that deep relationship and even the level of accountability that covenant relationship requires one to another. Have you seen coming out of pandemic where people were isolated for so long and doing church almost exclusively virtually where they couldn't be in the room together? Have you seen a shift in some places or some areas back to a more a rebirth of covenant relationship or a recapturing of that?
I would almost say I've seen the reverse.
Oh,
It just in and very generally speaking, I think there are a lot of people who've gotten out of the habit of regularly attending
mm,
church. I think we got busy again. And I, speak for myself certainly in that too. Yeah, I think with or without a pandemic, with or without quarantining, our understanding of covenant relationship is going to come from deep, deep discipleship.
mhm,
I love the word discipleship, love the word sanctification. Those are two of my favorites. Um, and I think that is going to happen, that kind of covenant relationship in a mature believer, a mature family, is going to happen regardless of what circumstances they find themselves in.
mhm,
I am a big fan of sanctuaries, of holy spaces. Not that you can't find God in all kinds of places. I just really love a good sanctuary. And about a month, let's say, into the pandemic, I was like, I have a key to my church. If I just sneak in like at night and just sit in the sanctuary, I think that would do my soul so much good. I didn't do it, but that's what I would hope. I would hope that we could create a community, and I know churches are working so hard to do this, where you would miss one another, you would
mhm.
miss the sanctuary. Yeah, there's things of God that you can find in a church environment that you can't find anywhere else. And I would hope as our as our discipleship deepens and we know more and more things of God, that we would hunger for that.
What stopped you from going in that night and using the key that you had? Have you reflected on that and wondered why? Or
I'm a rule follower for sure. That would have been like breaking and entering even with my key. Plus they're cape in the sanctuary, all sanitized, and so.
Yeah, it's thinking about that. The parish that I came from before my current call and other churches that I've encountered in Virginia, they actually leave the doors unlocked. And I saw signs in my previous parish where I'd go in one morning before I went into the office and find that somebody had come in. There was a prayer book open or a hymnal open. There may have been a few dollars left on the table. Nobody ever signed the visitor's book, but just it made me feel good to know that people, when they needed the church was there, the building and the space for them to use. And I wish we were at a point where we could do that with all churches. I would love to know that I could go into any town. And if I needed the space, know that there was an open door to do that. Again, it limits church, as you said, to the confines of the four walls. And I'm constantly preaching about church doesn't end at the four walls. That's just the start of it. The world is the church. So I want to shift back a little bit. You mentioned that one of the things that came up in the first chapter was your first Ash Wednesday experience. I recall in seminary or early in my ministry reading that if you ever see something mentioned in the Bible twice, pay attention to it. Ash Wednesday was something that I saw mentioned not twice, but multiple times in your book. And it was almost as a bookend, because you have your solo Ash Wednesday at the beginning, and then towards the end, the Ash Wednesday with your daughter. And so I see that particular day in the church calendar as a thread that's running through. And I'm curious, what about Ash Wednesday resonated so deeply with you? Because you used a word in relation to it as well, the blessing of Ash Wednesday. And even I, as a priest, have never thought blessing. It's, for me, it's a reminder of our roots and of creation and of where we're going. But I wonder if you talk a little bit about why Ash Wednesday resonates so deeply with you, because again, it came up quite often in some lovely ways.
Interesting. I'm going to go back and look for that now. I can tell you it has become my favorite church calendar observation. And the reason why is because it's for everyone. I have struggled to wrap my head around whether a Catholic truly believed I was a Christian if I couldn't take their communion, for example. And when I walk into an Ash Wednesday service, everyone's invited, even more than communion. That's worth unpacking. That's super interesting. I love the words that are spoken. I love encounters with a priest one-on-one. Again, something that in some churches I am not allowed to do. Well, that's not true. I thought I wasn't allowed to do. And I have Advent and Lent are new to me. And so Ash Wednesday is a really cool way to kick off Lent. So for me, it also points to a season that I look forward to as I learn about it more. So I would say those things. I have not written about this yet, but I'll share with you. Our church we did an Ash Wednesday once. I think I mentioned that in the book. We used to meet at a middle school, so it was kind of hard to do a midweek anything. But one Sunday we did have the palm branches from the year before, and we did do a semblance of an Ash Wednesday service. And last year we did another one. We are in our own building now, and they added some, partly because of the virus, we had different stations, and like it was either like a popsicle stick or a spoon. And so you dipped your own ashes and put the mark on yourself, and they had a mirror there. So what I call that is, we'll do it, but we're going to do it evangelical style. Because the service itself was also different. They did, and I don't know if I went to an Episcopal Ash Wednesday service and a Catholic Ash Wednesday service, how similar they would be. So maybe I'm being a little hard on my experience, but there was a part of me that thought, oh, I should have went to the Catholic one in the morning, because I didn't feel like I also love, and my pastor loves this about me, I love the traditional liturgy.
Yeah.
There's a couple passages I do not have memorized that we say when I go to a Catholic mass. They're so powerful, and I have barely even touched the surface of the Book of Common Prayer and everything that it has inside of it. And so I think that was part of my pushback. I was very thankful that we acknowledged a day in the church calendar at my church. But then I was like, why do we always have to change it? It's the same with Stations of the Cross. I go to some and I'm like, this thing's 2,000 years old. Why did we have to put our spin on it? There's still some pushback on what I call too Catholic. It can't be too Catholic.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned the Book of Common Prayer and just becoming familiar with it. One of the courses I've taught in past years is an introduction to the Book of Common Prayer. And the first thing I do is invite people to pick it up and hold the book sideways and look and see where the two most faded parts are. And without fail, I can say one of them is morning prayer, one of them is Eucharist. And I'll have it open it, and invariably it's morning prayer and Eucharist, but they're missing the noonday prayer and the Compline and the evening prayer and the wealth of things. So I'm glad to know that you're continuing to dive in, because it's a much deeper pool in the Book of Common Prayer than a lot of people, even Episcopalians, are aware of.
Yeah. My editor told the joke that it was somebody, an Episcopalian one time, was looking at the Bible and they're like, hey, they have some stuff for the Book of Common Prayer in here.
Yes, because the King's English came before the Bible.
Right.
You wrote something, and this is one of the things I mentioned before we started recording that deeply resonated with me. And you write about the fact that for some people, the church of their childhood is the only church that they will ever know. The church where I'm currently serving actually factors in not just an arc of my life, but a circle of my life. It's the church that raised me as a teenager.
Oh, wow.
And my family and I joined there, and it's very much at the root of who I am. And so now, 29 years later, leaving my previous Washington communications career and going into the vocation of ministry, I've been called back. And you talk about, even though in your own journey, you visited different churches and different traditions throughout, the Southern Baptist roots are still very much at the core and almost called to you wherever you are. So while the location for both of us has changed, what pulls at our heart hasn't. So with that in mind, for somebody that's struggling and thinking that, or they didn't find a church at any point in their life, their childhood or now, and may find themselves just being resigned to the fact that that church for them is not out there, what would you say to encourage them to keep going, especially if it's been a difficult journey for them trying to find that church home?
Even if they're, let's say, a cradle Catholic, I like that term because it's two C's, cradle Catholic, and it's stale, or they're wondering, or they're upset with current events of Catholicism, whatever the reason, I always encourage visiting other places, because whether it means you return more fully to what you came from, or whether it means you go in a new direction, you realize that Christianity is way, way, way bigger than what you've experienced. And I think that's been one of the number one gifts that I have received. I one time I was in a writing group on Facebook, and they mentioned the term cringeworthy Bible verses. And I thought, oh my goodness, but I knew what they meant, right? I mean, we have cringeworthy things maybe in our church experiences that we need to heal. And again, deep discipleship, and Jesus will do that. But part of that process might be going somewhere that's completely different, going to a non-denominational service where it's kind of like a rock band doing praise and worship, and then some guy in skinny jeans gets up and preaches a sermon. That's going to be really different for a Catholic, I would think. And so definitely exploring. And I would also, this is kind of partnering, but a little different direction. I would explore your traditions past. Now for Southern Baptists, that might get a little sticky. But still, I think a lot of our traditions have so much good in the past. I will forever be thankful to Southern Baptists for the heart they gave me for missions, because they are very keen on going worldwide. And we did not have the church calendar, but every Christmas we would give money. I think I've got it right. Christmas we'd give money to the Annie Armstrong offering, and Easter we would give money to the Lottie Moon offering. And so I don't know who those two women were, but they are missionaries. and we celebrated them and remembered them. So I would encourage you to go back and look at the good things in the past of your tradition as well, because every tradition gets bumpy, and we don't have a perfect church existence here. You won't find it no matter how hard you look, but these things might be enough to shake up the staleness that you feel, the meh approach to church, to kind of reignite your faith.
Well, and I know part of the joy of your journey has been learning about the ancient creeds and the church history and the past things. And one of the things that really moved me was where you write about the fact that sometimes, and again paraphrasing, but sometimes you grieve the fact that you didn't know in your youth more about, or have opportunities to learn more about, the roots of your faith. But I wonder, and I'd be curious to your response to this, do you think maybe the journey has been richer for you because you didn't have the exposure to that, and possibly the journey would have been different for you? So do you see maybe a gift in the fact that you mourned something that you didn't have growing up, but now may have in a much richer and grander way?
I write through that a lot, actually, in projects that I'm working on now. That's part of what I'm diving into, because I give the example. One Sunday morning I was in church, and my church, as I'm sure I've already kind of alluded to, is contemporary in style, very evangelical feeling. And one morning we were in the middle of a praise and worship song, and I really strongly thought in my mind, I wonder what the Orthodox are doing right now. Like, are they on their 37 out of 42 recitations of the Jesus prayer? Because they really do say it 42 times in a row. So fascinating. And as I explored that idea later, and the fact that I had that thought right in the middle of my own church service, God kind of poked me a little and said, there's some pride in that. And what I mean by that is, number one, I know what the Orthodox do because I have visited their church. And number two, if I had been focused on the songs and the message and, the what have you of my own church, it is also biblically based, and it is also a time to feed my spirit, and that does happen Sunday after Sunday. And so it was more about where that thought was coming from than the fact that I actually had that thought. And I think I have found often I ask a lot of Twitter questions. That's how you and I met. I'm thankful for that. And if I mention liturgy in a question, what do you think of liturgy, for example? I will inevitably have someone say, I grew up with it. It was stale, boring, didn't have any idea what I was saying, said it over and over again in my sleep. And now I'm attending an evangelical church and we do Bible study and we do, so yes, I have found across the board, we have got to have our hearts in what we're learning and what we're saying. I have also met Episcopalians who have done that for life. And the words that they pray every morning at noon, hopefully, and Compline too, are beautiful and meaningful. So yes, there's a little bit of this is new for me. So how fun to learn a new thing. But I also think there's a steadfastness if our hearts are right.
If you really want to dive into the full cycle of prayer, and I know you wrote that at one point you were trying to do the 7 times a day cycle.
Yeah, I'm bad at that.
Well, well, it's hard. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky. It's the Trappist monastery where Thomas Merton lived. And you can actually do retreats there. And so for a period of 3 years, I would go and do solo silent retreats and would try to do the 7 times of prayer and getting up at 3 a.m. for the first one and going through the day. And you're right, it's incredibly, incredibly difficult. And I finally had to, for me, it didn't work. I was trying to force my way through it and instead kept falling asleep and sleeping in, and suddenly realized there are other ways to pray without having to use what's on the printed page, what's happening right in front of me. So if you do want to try the full 7 times a day and really get the communal experience, that's something that I recommend. But you're right, it is difficult. And it's hard because there's so many competing factors in life and in the world that butt heads with the desire to pray at morning prayer at 8 a.m. and noonday prayer and Compline. And I know it's a challenge for a lot of folks. Have you encountered anybody that's a big thing for them, is they don't feel like they can find the time to pray because there are 93 other things they feel like they need to be doing?
Well, I think the 3 times a day is so much more doable, way more practical, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know that I would come across anyone that would say they couldn't do that. I mean, I'm thinking even if you're working in an office environment, if you pluck your earbuds in at lunchtime, I use regularly the Pray As You Go app. And they walk individual, I forget, is it Jesuits that do that?
I think it is the Jesuits, yeah.
Okay. But they it opens with a piece of music, big variety of different styles of music each day, and then they will lead you via Lectio Divina through a passage of scripture, and there's a time of prayer. I think it's usually 10 to 12 minutes, but deeply me. I love that app. A lot of times if I get up in the morning and don't have time to do my regular routine, have to get out of the house earlier than usual, that's what I'll listen to on the way to whatever it is I'm headed to. And so, yeah, I think 3 times a day is definitely doable. I don't think anyone would argue that much. I just finished a book, Open and Unafraid. It's by David O. Taylor and was a student of Eugene Peterson's. And he majorly unpacks the Psalms, how they are point to pretty much any emotion, any stage, any point in life that we encounter. And one of the things he says at the very beginning of his book is that he asked Eugene Peterson one time, what's your recommendation for how to interact with the Psalms? And Eugene's response was, read the first one then the next day read the next one, then the next day read the next one. And so he said he did that for a number of years and experienced the power of the Psalms forming him. And that's so much of what a liturgical tradition, et cetera, would argue for, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in November, I'm going to start the process. I haven't decided if I'm going to do one psalm a day because Psalm 119 sticks out in my mind.
Right.
And that would be an incredibly long day of reading a psalm and probably ineffective to read all of that with the purpose I have in mind of reading the Psalms this way. But I've heard the BCP has a Psalter in it. And so I think I might check that out. I'm still thinking through what the November Psalm project looks like. But, and, you know, as I do, I try out these new spiritual practices and write about them. You know, they'll be in a book or a blog post or a tweet or something. And all to try to encourage people to, again, shake it up, you know, try some new thing. I do, in addition to the BCP, I probably have 3 or 4 other prayer books, you know, so some days I'm reading with the Puritans and some days I'm reading with the Coptic Orthodox. But I think, I don't know why I keep saying I know. That's the beauty of Christianity. And that's what I have found is it's all my Christianity. It's all my Jesus and it's all our Jesus and our Christianity. And so that has definitely widened and deepened my faith, that I can explore all of that and find different ways to connect with Christ through the process.
To the various ways that you're journeying with to enrich your own spiritual life. If you haven't tried it, let me throw in Celtic prayer too, which you can also pray over the course of the day. It's much more, for me, it's much more connected to the earth.
Okay.
And
I have heard good things. I don't know if I have a book yet though, so I'll look. Yeah, I've heard their spirituality is very beautiful.
Yeah.
The Puritans are hard on themselves. I'm like, man, like all have sinned and fall short. That's pretty much how I feel after I read those prayers.
I want to talk a little bit about North Point, the church that you attend now. And you did say that you've got a permanent building now, but one thing that struck me when you first joined, it was a putting up and tearing down every Sunday, putting up the worship space, tearing down the worship space, shifting to whatever part, I think it was a school that you worshiped in. So you couldn't be in the cafeteria, you'd be in the gym or something like that. And I love the fact, because for me, it was very much the community as a whole, the congregation as a whole was building the church. It wasn't just inviting people in to build the congregation. You were very intentional and very deeply involved in actually putting the church together. And, you know, that resonated with me. And I wonder if you all have encountered, as the congregation at North Point, you know, because we're in a time where some churches, congregations go down to such a small size, they close the church. There are churches that close for a variety of reasons, sadly. But have you seen that the North Point, I hate to say the North Point model, because model makes it sound a little too legalistic. But have you seen that others have been inspired by that communal building of the church in every sense of the word?
I want to go back first and say that it's very fun to teach children the story of the tabernacle when you are a church that packs up and unpacks every Sunday because they get it. They're like, oh, they did it just like we did, or we did it like them, actually. So I remember teaching that a few times and being like, you know what that's like? We do this every week. But, you know, I think even we've been in our church maybe 4 years. And I would say that still carries with us to a certain degree. We don't have the tie to that was my grandpa's church or that was my great grandpa's church, right?
Mhm.
We don't have that kind of connection to a church building. And
Right.
so I would say we're still very good at going mobile. And we're very good about inviting. We did not create a traditional church
Mhm.
space.
Mhm.
We're in a beautiful building, but knew from the beginning when we first started its construction that we wanted it to also be a community space. And so we do a ton of dinners for the community, and we've invited kids in during the summer to partnering with the schools to offer free lunches to those who needed it.
Mhm.
It's there's a fluidity to it, I guess. Is it a community building or is it a church? It's both. And I think that points back to and how, the church was planted, and we spent that time in the middle school. We were forced. I remember one Christmas Eve, we had a service like we always did, and it was going to be outside at the local, like there's a gazebo in one of the little city parks,
Mhm.
and it was at the gazebo, and it was freezing rain. Like I remember them being worried about their instruments and what, they were going to be able to do, how they were going to keep them covered.
Right.
And I was like, I'm going to the Methodist church tonight. Like I skipped out. I was fair weather. I was like, I know there's other churches in town doing just as good a work. So yeah, I didn't do that. But that's interesting to think through. I would say some of that mentality has served us well.
Yeah. Oh, fair weather, actually from the practical nature, fair and foul weather are
Yeah,
very
one or the
heavy,
other.
heavy determiners. Yeah. You write about at one point how everybody who's passionate for the Lord, and not just clergy, lay leaders, people in the pews, face their times of exhaustion. And that's another point that resonated deeply with me, especially coming out of COVID, where I read this and I'm like, yes, yes, yes. Because I don't think people understand truly that clergy and lay leaders were trying to do more. I was talking to Nadia Boltz-Weber once. I think you watched that interview, and she talked
Yeah.
about the fact that clergy and lay leaders were exhausted because they were suddenly in the position of having to overprogram and do more with the same amount of time and more of things that in normal time they wouldn't have been doing anyway. Um, and knowing how involved you are at North Point as a lay leader, in addition to everything that you do on in your own life with the writing and blogging and small group leading, what did you do besides your prayer life? Because I know how important that is to you. But did you find there was anything that helped you preserve your strength and keep you at somewhat of a point of being even throughout the pandemic, but B, bringing an awareness to people that, it's not an automatic thing for parish leaders and congregations to do this. This is a new thing, and, bear with us.
Yeah, I think we're still filtering all of that out, aren't we?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
One thing that came to mind as you were asking the question, when we closed the first time, that would have been in March, we had maybe 2 weeks left of a Bible study series that we were working on. And so we took that to Zoom. And I hate leading Bible study on Zoom. Hate might seem strong, but it's very unnatural. I lost just the presence of people in a room.
Yes.
That was what I missed. I remember watching my pastor. A couple times he gave sermons from his office, one time from an empty sanctuary, and then another time I'm thinking of he was outside. And how strange, whenever your whole purpose as a shepherd is to connect with your sheep, but they're on the other side of a screen. And so when I discovered I did not like teaching Bible study on Zoom, I was honest with people about that. I said, I will Zoom talk with you to talk like this, or
Mhm.
to, have a catch up. We did Advent via Zoom that year, which was a lot different because you don't have your Bibles open in a Bible study that you're going through point by point, much more relaxed, more like a book club, if you will.
Mhm.
And I just said, I can't do that. We can do other things, but and I think that's important for ministry leaders, for lay people. I did a Bible study years and years ago that said, if you always say yes to everything, you're taking some opportunities from other people
Mm.
that would have, been blessed by doing that.
Mhm.
And so I'm pretty good, I think, about honing my skills, knowing what I do well and what I think I've gotten better and better at that. And sure enough, there was a new gal that started teaching. We have 3 Bible studies, and so there was a new lady who started teaching the Monday morning one, and she said, I would love to lead a group via Zoom. She goes, I'm pretty much very self-quarantined right now and at home, and would love to reach out in that way.
Mhm.
And I've probably thanked her 100 times for she is our person that, if, because we do have some more homebound individuals still.
Sure.
And she is that person who is like, bring in my way. I will do Bible study via Zoom. And I'm so thankful that she will, because it is needed, but it was really not a great fit for me. And obviously there are some things that we have to plow through and do anyway. But yes, that ability to say no, if
Mhm.
it's really not a fit. And then I, part of it is just kind of the way God has carved it out for me. But I also think that part of it matches my personality and the way I'm wired. I am alone a lot.
Mhm.
And I have, I don't need a full calendar. I get nervous if it gets too full.
Mhm.
And I think, and again, some parents in some seasons just hold on. Just cling to the wheel and keep driving, because your time hopefully is coming. But when there's a season for you to have some downtime and a quiet car ride on your way to work, when you might listen to the Pray As You Go app,
Mhm.
do it. The enemy's never, ever going to turn off his, oh, maybe you should do this, maybe you should do that, let's be busy, how busy can we,
Right.
he's always going to be meddling in that endeavor. But it's so important to carve that time out. It could even be as simple as bringing one of your prayer books, or finding one if you don't have one, or your Bible. And when you're sitting in the commuter line waiting, or not commuter line, in the pickup line waiting for your, kid to come out of school, rather than flipping through social media, those oftentimes those short prayers, or a chapter of the Bible, that'll take you 2 minutes
Yeah.
to read.
Yep.
It all counts. It all fills us up. And yeah, I think that would be the biggest encouragement that I would offer coming out of weary seasons. And that was a heaviness like I've not known
Mhm.
before, when we were in the thick of quarantining. And I know I saw it. This is not an original thought to me. I know I saw it elsewhere, but I think we really needed to be gentle with ourselves
Yeah.
and with one another. And I hope we were. Those are absolutely the times in my life when I'm going to turn to my hymn playlist rather
Mhm.
than my country music playlist. So yeah, and it might even be as simple as making a list of 4 or 5 things that spiritually comfort you.
Mhm.
Um, it could be waiting in the grocery store line, and under your breath you're muttering our Lord's Prayer, which
Mhm.
is a very grounding and a wonderful tie to Christianity around the world, across time. But yeah, it's going to be different for everyone. But if we're intentional about it, I think we can find those things.
Yeah. I agree with everything you said. And one thing I give thanks for, that even in the midst of the pandemic, when there was exhaustion and overprogramming and trying to do more and say yes to everything when we didn't have the right to, or didn't have a reason to, quite frankly. I think about what would have happened had this been 10 years ago, without Zoom, without live streaming, without Facebook Live and all these different things. It would have been, I think, to the point of almost devastation for people, because I don't think, except for people that either were raised in the tradition of praying daily and reading the Bible daily, or people that had a familiarity with praying the daily office in the Episcopal tradition, for instance, they would have been lost. And, I will say a gift of the pandemic is people did take it upon themselves to learn the daily office and ways of praying. So for all the faults of technology and the impersonality and the truthfully draining nature, you've got the personal connection, but there's no physical connection. I guess in a way, there's still a gift. So I try very hard to look for the, I hate to quote Monty Python, but the closing song in Life of Brian is always look on the bright side of life. And that's what I'm trying to do in the pandemic, is find a glimpse of that. So I do give thanks for the technology that we've got. I want to shift away from the book now and to two other areas that you're involved in that I love. And one of them is the weekly emails that come out every Saturday morning, 7 Things. Mm-hmm. And for me, I love them because every time I open my inbox on Saturday and I see this email from you, it strikes me as being similar to a friend calling, saying, hey, Matt, guess what I saw this week, or guess what I read this week. And I love the way you pull together blog posts, you pull together recipes, articles you've read, a pretty cat that ran down the street, you take a picture and throw that up or something like that. And I love it because it's such a nice, comforting thing to have show up in my inbox. Where did that idea come from? It's such a great gift.
First, thank you very much. I appreciate your kind words about it. It was actually a pretty practical piece for me. In the writing and publishing world, you hear all the time, build your email list, build your email list. And when I sent off the proposal for my first book, I think I had 75 people on that email list, and I was not regularly communicating with them via email. And so I knew in my head, I thought I've got to come up with something that works, and for me and for my readers. And sometimes, and I know if you have writers who are listening, there's so many places for those words to go, and there's only so many words.
Yeah.
Like, we're supposed to write Facebook posts, and we're supposed to, tweet on a regular basis, and also take good pictures because Instagram likes pictures, and have this email list. And I was like, I couldn't come up with an authentic way to connect with readers, which is the only way I want to connect.
Right.
And Traci Smith is her name. I'm trying to think if it's Treasures with Traci. I get her emails. I just am blanking on exactly what it's called, but she's a pastor and has a very effective email list. She writes a little more pastoral specific, and has a couple of books praying with families, like family prayer books. And so our lists don't match, but her idea is one that I loved and that I borrowed. And I was already reading these fascinating articles and preparing for Bible study, or I also lead a chronological Bible group online. And I was sharing them like on Facebook or wherever. And I was like, well, I mean, they're getting a few likes, but they're not my most engaging posts.
Yeah.
And so I thought, why don't I take those and remove them from social media and make those, what my readers can feed on. I loved the idea of Saturday morning because exactly what you described. I envisioned maybe a little time period of 15 minutes where somebody could sit down with their cup of tea or coffee and scroll through these. And the variety is very fun. I try hard to find a variety of things. And just from the emails that I receive every week from all these different places, and like I said, the preparation that I'm doing for the times that I teach scripture, I have a slew of this is never hard for me to come up with, right? 7 things is very easy for me to find throughout my week. And so, yeah, we've played with it and it has gone well. It's always fascinating for me. I'm able to go into the mail program that I use and see what posts are the most popular and are open often. I'm happy to report that people usually read my blog posts when I share them. That's encouraging. And then books, anytime you mention any books that you're reading or reviewing, people love to check those out. And then since July, I decided that I would put together just a PDF cookbook, a simple project, but it's friends that I have made on social media sharing their potluck recipes, because as a former Southern Baptist, I will always and forever love a good potluck.
And let me interject that when you talk early on in the book about a potluck in the basement of one of the churches that you attended as a child, not only did it resonate with me because my family, that was a family setup at the old family home place.
Okay.
But the layout that you shared, it's like, yep. And in my mind, I'm walking from one end of the table
universal.
to the other. It's universal. Absolutely. So thanks for that. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And so I think total there's been 21 different recipes that I've shared on a weekly basis, and those have been highly popular. I'm now thinking I'm going to have to think through how I'm going to keep incorporating recipes in this email, because people are opening those a lot and hopefully trying a few of them.
Well, and I tend to overthink things. So when I saw that it was 7 things, immediately I start, I'm big on representation and symbols of things. So I thought, oh, she's picked 7 because it's the 7th day. No, she's picked 7 because 7's the number of completion. I don't know. Did you just pick 7 because it's a good number, or
more alliteration? Saturday was 7.
Saturday. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess it could have been 6, but we don't like the number 6 a whole lot as Bible scholars. So yeah.
Oh yeah. A lesson to me. Don't overthink.
I'm sure 7 was subconsciously in my mind as well for other reasons.
So as we get here to the end, I want to ask you kind of a fun or unusual, or depending on how you approach it, I hope it's not terrifying. But you and I are in a building on the 4th or 5th floor. We're getting into the elevator and we've got 4 or 5 floors for you to plug yourself and what you're doing. So given that time, what would you like to share with folks that we haven't talked about with the book or in your life as a way of continuing to build community and bring people together even more? And there's no time limit. I'm not going to ding at any point when we get to the ground floor.
Well, I am unapologetically a church girl. And so I would lead there and I would say what I have discovered that I am so anxious for everyone to discover is that getting to know one another and our faiths and listening and being respectful in the process not only allows us to know one another, but also gives us more and more of Jesus. And at the end of that process, as I'm going through it day after day, so much abundant life, which is what Jesus promised us. And so I love the way it all intertwines, and it's just been a very fun adventure to be on.
Well, it's been a joy for me to share in the parts of the journey that you've been so open with and willing to share with us. How can people connect with you and your writing and your tweeting and everything else?
Sure. My blog is tracesoffaith.com. I don't post as regularly as I used to, but there's a lot of material there. And on Twitter and Pinterest, I'm Traces of Faith. Facebook and Instagram, Traces of Faith blog. And I think that's it. My book is available anywhere books are sold. You can even go to Target and have them order it. It's not on their shelf yet, but you can have them order it, or definitely your independent bookstores. Love supporting those.
Yes.
So yeah, would be happy to connect in any of those ways.
And very much looking forward to the next one. Traci, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to chat with me. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
God bless.